Ring Out Wild Bells by Wilcott Gibbs. Our production, A Midsummer Night's Dream, was given on the open-air stage at the Riverdale Country School shortly before the war. The scenery was only the natural scenery of that suburban dell, and the cast was exclusively male, ranging in age from 11 to perhaps 17. It must be admitted that our version had its drawbacks. The costumes were probably the worst things we had to bear, because we were costumed by our parents. My costume for the character, Puck, was mysterious but spectacular. Beginning at the top, there was a cap with 3 stuffed horns. Then a pair of tights that covered me to my wrists and ankles. And finally, slippers with stuffed toes that curled up at the ends. The whole thing was made out of silk in alternate green and red stripes, and it was covered from head to foot with 1,000 tiny bells. Because our costumes were obviously perishable, we never wore them in rehearsal. And naturally, nobody knew that I was invested with these peculiar sound effects until I made my entrance at the beginning of the second act. Our director was a man who had strong opinions about how Shakespeare should be played. It was his theory that Puck was the incarnation of mischief. So I had been coached to bound onto the stage, and once there, to dance up and down, cocking my head and waving my arms. I had my own misgivings about those dangerously abundant gestures and their probable effect on my bells. It was too late, however, to invent another technique for playing Puck. I bounded onto the stage. The effect, in its way, must have been superb. With every leap, I rang like 1,000 children's sleighs. It was even worse when I came to the middle of the stage and went into my gestures. To a blind man, it must have sounded as though I had dangerously decided to accompany myself on a xylophone. Puck's first remark is addressed to one of the fairies. "How now, fair spirit, whither wander you?" This unhappy child, already embarrassed by a public appearance in cheesecloth and tinsel, was also burdened with an opening speech of 16 lines in verse. He began bravely. "Over hill, over dale, through bush, through briar, over park, over pale, through flood, through fire." At the word fire, my instructions were to bring my hands up from the ground in a long, wavery sweep, intended to represent fire. The bells pealed. The fairy stopped in his lines and looked at me sharp. "I do wonder everywhere. Shh! Swifter than the moon sphere." Here again I had another cue for sort of a swoop and dip, indicating the swiftness of the moon sphere. Again the bells rang out, and again the performance stopped in its tracks. The fairy was clearly troubled by these interruptions. He had, however, a child's strange acceptance of the inscrutable, and was even able to regard my bells as a last-minute adult addition to the program. My turn, when it came, was even worse. By that time, the audience had succumbed to a helpless gaiety. I began my speech. "Louder! You will have to talk louder!" It was the director. "And for heaven's sake, stop that jingling!" I talked louder and tried to stop the jingling. Oh, but it was no use. By the time I got to the end of my speech, I was shouting, and so was the audience. All of this had a very bad effect on the fairy, who by this time had many symptoms of complete nervous collapse. He began his next speech. "Either I mistake your shape and making quite, or else you are that shrewd and knavish spirit called Robin Goodfellow. Are you not he that?" At this point, I forgot that the rules had changed, and I was supposed to leave out the gestures. There was a furious jingling, and the fairy goat. Are you not he that? He looked miserably at the wings, and the director supplied the next line. Oh, but the tumult was too much for him. The unhappy child shook his head. Say anything! Anything at all! The fairy shut his eyes and shuddered. All right, Puck, you begin your next speech. By some miracle, I actually did remember my next lines, and had opened my mouth to begin on them, when suddenly the fairy spoke. His voice was a high, thin monotone, and there seemed to be madness in it, but it was perfectly clear. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived. He said it right through to the end. And it certainly was the most successful speech ever given on that stage. And probably one of the most successful speeches ever given on any stage. I don't remember, if I ever knew, how the rest of us ever picked up on the dull, normal thread of the play after that extraordinary performance. But we must have, because I know it went on. I only remember that in the next intermission, the director cut off my bells with his penknife. And after that, things quieted down and got dull.